Ever wondered what happens when an HOA goes too far? So far they destroy something priceless? Stick around, because this is Listen HOA Stories, where neighborhood drama turns into unbelievable battles. They didn't just damage it, they wiped out everything. Last Tuesday, I pulled into my driveway and froze. My grandfather's 43-year-old hunting cabin, the place where generations of my family had made memories, was gone. Not damaged. Not vandalized. Completely obliterated, reduced to splinters scattered across the yard, and standing in the middle of the wreckage, like she had just scored the winning lottery ticket, was Brittany Turner, our HOA president. Clipboard in hand, smug grin on her face, she actually waved me over as if she were doing me a favor. "That's what happens when you don't pay your dues," she announced, handing me a demolition invoice for $20. My hands trembled with rage. This wasn't just a structure. It was where my grandfather taught me to whittle, where I planned to propose to Linda next month, just like my dad had proposed to my mom decades earlier. Now it was dust. But Brittany had no idea what kind of storm she'd just unleashed. Have you ever watched someone make the worst mistake of their life in real time? Tell me in the comments, because that's exactly what was happening here. The shock hit me like a punch to the gut. One moment I was thinking about dinner. The next I was staring at an empty space where family history used to stand. I sat in my car, frozen, before finally stepping out and realizing this wasn't a bad dream. The cabin was gone, and Brittany was standing there in her spotless white blazer, blonde hair immaculate despite the dust swirling in the air, acting like the queen of destruction. She lifted the clipboard like it was a crown and greeted me with fake concern dripping from her voice. "Jim, glad I caught you before you noticed. I know this must be hard." The insincerity made my skin crawl. She wasn't consoling me. She was gloating. When I demanded answers, she coolly presented a document, an emergency demolition order signed by someone named Michael Davis, supposedly a city inspector. Her story was rehearsed, her tone condescending, like she'd given this speech dozens of times before. The problem? My instincts told me it was all a lie. The signature looked rushed. The letterhead was off. And timing like this was too perfect to be coincidence. Still, she kept going. The demolition cost was $12,000, plus $8,000 in your outstanding compliance fines, unauthorized modifications, landscaping issues, fence violations. Total balance due in 30 days. Or we move toward foreclosure. She said it with a politician's fake sympathy, as if I should thank her, but I wasn't like her past victims. Instead of crumbling, I started documenting everything. Photos of the wreckage, the paperwork, even her smug smile. "I'm calling the sheriff," I said, dialing Rhiannon. If Brittany thought she could bully some underpaid government worker into coughing up $20,000 for her scam, she was about to learn just how badly she had underestimated me. I stared at that fake signature again, my voice dropping to a whisper as the weight of it all sank in. If Michael Davis doesn't exist, then who in the world signed off on this demolition? The question lingered in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Deep down, I knew chasing that answer would flip this entire situation on its head. By 9 a.m. the next morning, I was standing inside the county courthouse. Years of reviewing questionable evidence in federal cases, plus Linda's legal training, had taught me where to start. Margaret, the county clerk who'd been handling property records since the Reagan years, barely glanced at the document before raising her eyebrows. "This is irregular," she muttered, sliding her glasses up the bridge of her nose. Emergency demolitions require multiple approvals and at least a 24-hour public notice. This has none of that. Then she pulled up the cabin's full record history. Her fingers clicked across the keyboard as decades of files filled the screen. "Well, here's something," she said slowly. "Your cabin was built in 1974, 15 years before this HOA even existed. Under state law, that makes it a grandfathered structure. They had no authority to touch it. My heart pounded. You mean the HOA never had the right to demolish it in the first place? Margaret nodded, bringing up the original permits and surveys. Not only was it protected, but removing a grandfathered structure without the owner's written consent is a felony. Someone could face prison for this. There it was, bulletproof documentation. Permits from June 1974. County approval. Proper construction. The HOA didn't even come into existence until 1989, and their own bylaws acknowledged older structures as exempt. Brittany Turner hadn't just overreached. She had committed an actual crime. But then Margaret clicked one more file, and the bigger picture came into focus. Turner Properties, LLC, she said carefully. 12 acquisitions in the last 2 years. Families forced out under HOA violations. Every one of those properties flipped to a developer, Megadev Corporation, for a hefty profit. She leaned back, giving me a grim look. Your lot completes their puzzle. They're lining up a $15 million luxury project. My stomach sank. Brittany hadn't targeted me for late fees. She'd targeted me because I owned the last piece of land she needed. Then Margaret slid another document across the desk, and my blood went cold. Brittany's personal victim research profile. It was chillingly thorough. My income estimate, $45,000. My work schedule. My family history. Even supposed legal vulnerabilities. Notes scrawled in the margins. Low-level government employee. Limited resources. Perfect intimidation target. She had studied me the way a predator studies prey. I snapped photos of everything, building an evidence file that no prosecutor could ignore. Systematic fraud. Financial motive. Vulnerable homeowners preyed upon. Brittany's handwriting tied to it all. But the final nail came when Margaret pulled up the contractor permits. Every single one bore the same forged name. Michael Davis. It wasn't a one-time fraud. It was a system. That evening, Linda came home with her laptop and her war face. She'd spent the flight digging into HOA case law and federal property statutes. When she spread her research across our dining table, her conclusion was blunt. This whole demolition is illegal, she said flatly. Grandfathered structures are protected under state law. And Brittany's targeting of vulnerable groups? That could qualify as a federal civil rights violation. I laid Margaret's stack of evidence beside her notes. It gets worse. She's not just picking on me. She's been running this scam for years, targeting the elderly, young families, and government workers who can't afford to fight back. Linda scanned the documents, her eyes narrowing. This isn't about your cabin anymore, she said, her tone shifting into that sharp edge she used in court. This is a criminal conspiracy. Dozens of families ruined. The FBI is going to love this, and she was right. Once Turner Properties sold to out-of-state developers, the whole thing crossed state lines, making it a federal crime. Later that night, while Linda continued digging through precedents, I slipped into the backyard, standing where the cabin once stood. In my hands was my grandfather's old tackle box, one of the few things that survived the demolition. Inside, tucked neatly among rusted lures and faded bobbers, was his fishing license. Renewed just 6 months before he passed. Even facing death, the man had followed every rule, every regulation, always playing fair. And now here I was, holding the proof that Brittany's empire was built on lies, while my grandfather's legacy was built on integrity. Linda placed a hand on my shoulder, studying the license with quiet respect. Your grandfather would be proud, she said softly. You're not lashing out. You're building a case, gathering evidence, exposing the truth the right way, and in that moment, I knew she was right. This wasn't just personal anymore. This was war.GHT in front of her. For the first time, her confidence faltered. The deputy who arrived was professional but cautious. He photographed the scene, took my statement, and promised to file a report. But I could read his body language. As far as law enforcement was concerned, this was a civil dispute unless I could prove fraud. After he left, I stood in silence, surrounded by ruins. Linda wouldn't be home until morning, which meant I had one long night to uncover the truth. I studied the demolition order again under my phone's flashlight. The inspector's name, Michael Davis, didn't exist in any county records. I searched every department: permits, code enforcement, fire safety. Nothing. That's when the realization hit me. If Michael Davis wasn't real, then the order itself was a forgery. And if it was forged, then Brittany hadn't just destroyed my grandfather's cabin. She'd committed a felony. And I was going to prove it. If you're just tuning in to listen to HOA stories, make sure you stick around, because what I uncovered next turned this neighborhood dispute into something much darker. She was right, but that didn't make the violation feel any less personal. That night, sleep never came. Instead, I stared at the ceiling, wondering how many other families had been caught in Brittany's web. The elderly couple 2 streets over who'd been forced into assisted living after racking up $40,000 in violations. The young parents with 3 kids who sold their home for $60,000 undervalued just to escape Turner Properties harassment. Or the retired teacher who lost his workshop to a so-called structural hazard that magically disappeared once he signed away his deed as a federal judge. I'd seen plenty of white-collar predators who thought they were untouchable. They all shared the same traits: arrogance, entitlement, and a smug belief their victims were too weak to resist. Brittany fit that mold perfectly, which meant sooner or later she'd make a fatal mistake. That mistake arrived the very next morning. Slipped under my front door was a plain manila envelope with no return address. Inside, photocopied pages of Brittany's personal planning documents. Handwritten notes, targeting strategies, timelines. My hands trembled as I read them. Phase 1, research and victim profiling. Phase 2, falsified documentation and authority staging. Phase 3, demolition and financial leverage. But it was her notes on Phase 4 that chilled me to the bone. I opened those papers with the nervous anticipation of a jury verdict. And what I found was even worse than I imagined. Detailed proof of premeditation, meticulous planning, and Brittany's own words, calling her victims sheep too stupid to recognize real power. She had documented her crimes with the confidence of someone who believed she'd never be caught. Linda found me in the kitchen, my hands clenched around the papers. She kept records of everything, I muttered, passing her a page that listed every family Brittany had targeted, threatened, and forced to sell. Linda's eyes widened. She documented her own conspiracy, like it was a business plan, but then we reached the last page. That's when the air left the room. Phase 4, permanent elimination of property ownership through coordinated legal and financial pressure. This wasn't just fraud. This was systematic life destruction, calculated profit at the expense of human lives. I whispered it aloud, the weight pressing down like a loaded gun. Phase 1 was research. Phase 2, preparation. Phase 3, my cabin. What the hell is Phase 4? The question lingered between us, heavier than smoke, and I knew the answer could change everything. That Wednesday night, the emergency HOA meeting felt like a powder keg. The community center buzzed with uneasy whispers, neighbors clutching their violation letters. Brittany had called this meeting with less than 24 hours. Notice, a sign of panic. I slipped into the back row as Brittany began her polished performance. Charts, PowerPoints, professional jargon. She stood at the podium like a corporate executive, delivering what she called community safety through proper enforcement. For 15 minutes, she painted herself as the neighborhood's savior, glossing over the fact her solutions involved forcing families out of their homes. The audacity was staggering. She even described the demolition of my grandfather's cabin as an emergency safety measure, and that's where she made her first real mistake, diving into technical details about structural codes and safety laws. The very area I knew inside and out, from my time overseeing construction litigation cases in federal court. Brittany clicked through slides showing engineering diagrams that were nothing more than generic stock illustrations. She claimed imminent collapse, compromised foundations, and coordinated emergency responses. To anyone else, her words sounded convincing. To me, it was a house of cards. When she finally wrapped up, I stood. The room went dead silent. "Mrs. Turner," I asked evenly, "can you show us the specific legal authority that allows an HOA to demolish grandfathered structures that predate its existence?" The question landed like a hammer blow. Her face faltered for the briefest second before she pasted on a practiced smile. "Mr. Rogers, the board consulted legal counsel and followed all protocols. Our experience with municipal regulations is extensive. It was a bureaucratic non-answer designed to scare people into silence. But I wasn't about to let her off easy." "Then show us. Show everyone here the legal statute that allows you to demolish a protected structure." The room held its breath. Brittany's polished act was cracking, and for the first time, the neighbors were seeing it too. And this was only the beginning. If you want, her confident tone was starting to wobble. She kept saying community safety like a mantra, but she drifted off her script and into territory where she could accidentally confess too much. That's when I pulled up the photos from the county courthouse on my phone and held them up for everyone to see. "According to these records," I said, "this cabin was built in 1974 and is protected under state grandfather clauses. The permit's valid and the original construction was county approved, no expiration." You could feel the room change. People who'd been nodding at Brittany's presentation suddenly looked at one another, puzzled. Mrs. Patterson, who'd known my grandfather longer than the HOA had existed, rose slowly, her voice steady. "So you demolished something that was perfectly legal?" she asked, and you could hear the moral outrage in every syllable. Brittany didn't answer the legal question. Instead, she lashed out with a cheap, personal swipe. "Mr. Rogers thinks his government job makes him untouchable," she snapped, her practiced composure cracking. "Some folks think rules don't apply to them just because they work downtown." The air cooled as neighbors realized this was less about safety than a grudge. That's when Tom Miller stood up, folder in hand, the folder I'd seen him bring in. "Actually, Brittany," he said, "I think everyone should see the financial picture." He opened the folder and laid out 2 years of HOA minutes that clearly showed a pattern. Certain families repeatedly targeted, then their properties sold to Turner Properties at prices below market value. The sequence, when laid out chronologically, looked deliberate. The room went from murmurs to a roar. People started comparing notes. The Hendersons had been cited for offense approval that had already been granted years ago. The Johnsons had been fined for landscaping issues that never made sense. Even some who'd supported Brittany shifted uncomfortably as the pattern emerged. Brittany tried to wrest the narrative back. "These are confidential HOA matters," she insisted, voice rising, trying to paint us as conspiracy theorists undermining proper governance. But Tom had the receipts, victim research profiles, targeting lists, and worst of all, the financials showing Turner Properties flipping these lots to Megadeth for huge profits. The image of our HOA president as a community steward started to crumble. She looked more like a predator who'd been quietly enriching herself. I stood, letting my voice carry across the suddenly hushed room. "Mrs. Turner, you claimed extensive municipal experience and said you followed proper procedures. You even said you had emergency authority that overrides state law. Are you ready to show us the legal statutes you promised?" Her eyes flashed, dangerous, theatrical. She leaned forward like someone about to deliver a knockout line. "Mr. Rogers," she said slowly, "you think you know what power looks like? Tomorrow night you'll learn the difference between actual authority and whatever tiny job you have downtown." Her threat detonated the room. People shouted, phones came out, and for the first time the neighbors saw her for what she'd become. I only smiled. Brittany had just executed her own professional death warrant before 80 witnesses. Ever had someone totally underestimate you? Drop your stories in the comments, because what happens next changes everything. Then, the next morning, the Federal Judicial Administration called, asking if they should investigate complaints that a federal employee named James Rogers was abusing government time to wage personal vendettas against HOA leaders. Brittany had actually tried to get me fired, filing official complaints against a federal judge to my own office. The irony nearly made me laugh. She'd spent 3 days calling federal offices, hoping someone would discipline me for fighting with the HOA president. While she was busy doing that, Linda was at our kitchen table building a federal quality case. She'd already pulled bank records and legal precedents, and that evening she handed me Turner Properties books, nearly $2 million in liabilities, across loans secured against properties they hadn't even closed on yet. The more we dug, the uglier it got: fraudulent permits, phony contractors, and forged signatures. I couldn't help but think how perfectly absurd it all was. Brittany, trying to ruin my career and reputation while handing me the evidence that would put her away. You can't script that kind of irony. To know what happened when her empire of lies finally collapsed, don't forget to subscribe to Listen HOA Stories. The next revelation will blow the doors wide open. My waterfront lot was the keystone between Brittany's empire and bankruptcy. I told him I'd meet on Friday, 24 hours to prepare an answer that would be both accurate and devastating. Thursday night, Linda and I stayed up organizing everything we had. She turned our piles of paper into a clear timeline that exposed Brittany's scheme in full: forged permits, targeted harassment, forced sales. By the time we finished, the stack looked like a federal indictment waiting to happen. Friday afternoon, I met with a local investigative reporter who'd been on Brittany's radar for spinning stories about government employee misconduct. I walked him through the files for 2 hours, every document, every bank record, every timeline entry. By the end, he was talking about front-page leads and investigative awards. Brittany's attempt at controlling the narrative had spectacularly backfired. She'd connected me to someone who could shine a national spotlight on her crimes. "She's not just greedy," Linda said, scrolling through loans and balance sheets. "She's desperate. If she can't finish the land assembly for Megadev, everything she's built in 2 years collapses." That explained the escalating fraud, the reckless behavior at the HOA meeting, and why she'd stepped so far over the line. We also got another gift from our anonymous informant that morning: a full copy of Brittany's development timeline. It showed exactly when each house had been targeted, pressured, and ultimately flipped. The documentation was clinical, as if she believed she was running a legitimate business rather than a criminal conspiracy. The arrogance was almost poetic. That night, Linda and I sat among evidence boxes where the cabin had stood, surrounded by what looked like the beginning of a federal prosecution. We'd moved well beyond property damage. Wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, civil rights violations, the list kept growing. Federal prosecutors would fight over the chance to take this case. But first, We needed Brittany to make the one mistake that would finish her. This is bigger than neighborhood squabbling, the reporter told me as we wrapped. It's predatory business, systematic fraud, abuse of community authority. If half of this checks out, your HOA president is going to prison. I assured him everything was documented and verifiable, and worse than he probably imagined. Are you ready? Linda asked later. Once we file this FBI package, we can't pull it back. Brittany Turner's life, as she knows it, is essentially over. I signed the complaint form, thinking about everyone she'd hurt. If exposing her meant she spent the next decade behind bars, then that was a consequence she'd earned. Saturday's mailbox surprise was almost laughable. Flyers announcing Brittany's community education session the next week. She planned to teach residents how to handle entitled government employees and protect community standards from outside interference. She was literally advertising a seminar on dealing with people like me. Linda read the flyer with a look that mixed disbelief and grim amusement. The irony was delicious. She'd even promised a live demonstration of proper techniques for neutralizing bureaucratic threats. In other words, a public how-to on sidelining federal employees. Unwittingly, Brittany was preparing to broadcast her own criminal playbook to the internet. Standing in the backyard that night, staring at the empty footprint of the cabin, I felt the fight change shape. This had become about justice for every family she'd ruined. If she wanted to turn her crimes into a community lesson, I was ready to write the counter-lesson. When the Federal Administrative Office called to ask if I needed security, I told Linda, she's trying to destroy everything I've built. But what happens when she realizes she picked the wrong government employee to target? The question hung in the air like smoke, and I knew the answer would be the most satisfying moment of my judicial career. Brittany spent the weekend polishing her masterpiece. Monday's mail was full of flyers promoting a leadership seminar scheduled for Friday, this time with a promise to live stream the event to HOAs nationwide. In other words, she planned to stream her playbook to anyone who would listen. I had to admit, Brittany's setup looked like something out of a professional seminar. The community center had been transformed into a mini conference hall with bright ring lights, multiple camera angles, and a backdrop plastered with Turner Properties, LLC logos and slogans about empowerment and resident rights. She'd even brought in a tech consultant to manage her live stream, fully expecting an audience from surrounding neighborhoods hungry for gossip about our community feud. The production value could have rivaled a corporate convention. She had a media crew controlling graphics, branded banners, and promotional clips showcasing her expertise in residential management and enforcement tactics. Brittany wasn't just throwing a meeting. She thought she was launching a consulting empire built on the rubble of families she'd systematically destroyed. Tuesday morning, Linda caught me poring over Brittany's glossy handouts with the kind of grim interest a prosecutor reserves for death penalty evidence. She's treating this like a TED Talk, Linda said, flipping through the agenda she'd distributed. The bullet points read less like neighborhood advice and more like a handbook for federal crimes. She planned to cover how to research vulnerable government employees, exploit legal loopholes, and leverage financial pressure to force compliance. In short, a masterclass in harassment and coercion, and Brittany was too arrogant to realize she was documenting her own conspiracy. The confidence was staggering. She'd spent her weekend calling neighbors, personally inviting them to what she described as the educational dismantling of government entitlement. According to Tom Miller, our unofficial mole inside the neighborhood, Brittany had been bragging nonstop about her insider research into federal systems and her supposed City Hall connections. She actually believed she understood how my world worked. Linda and I drafted our counterattack over dinner. The plan was simple and devastating. Create an anonymous account, Truthseeker 2024, to slip into Brittany's chat feed. From there, I bait her into explaining her method step by step, giving us a live stream confession before hundreds of witnesses. By the time she realized, she'd have walked herself straight into federal charges. Her ego only grew bolder. On Wednesday, she released a promotional video showcasing herself as a community protection specialist, complete with fake testimonials praising her leadership. Not one mentioned the families she'd bankrupted. Meanwhile, Linda spent the day drafting emergency contacts for prosecutors, FBI, financial crimes units, and media outlets, a launch list ready to trigger once Brittany's broadcast handed us the final proof. This is either going to be the highlight of your career, Linda said as we reviewed files, or the most spectacular example of someone self-destructing on camera since politicians discovered live streaming. By Thursday night, it felt less like neighborhood politics and more like prepping for a federal trial. We sorted our evidence into airtight categories, rehearsed contingencies, and finalized a strategy designed to let Brittany bury herself alive. I'd been in the judicial system for 30 years, but never had I seen someone so eager to gift-wrap her own prosecution. Friday morning brought the ultimate twist. Brittany had invited the local press to cover her educational demonstration on leadership. Her press release promised to show HOAs everywhere how to combat government, intimidation, and bureaucratic overreach. Translation: she was about to broadcast her entire playbook of fraud and coercion to the metropolitan area. I spent the afternoon reviewing statutes, wire fraud, mail fraud, civil rights violations, readying the federal complaint package we dropped the moment her words went live. The case was already solid, but once she outlined her scheme on camera, it would be legally bulletproof. That evening, as Linda and I sat surrounded by files, I thought about my grandfather's words: justice isn't about revenge, it's about consequences. Brittany had chosen to build her empire by preying on the vulnerable. Tomorrow night, she'd finally meet the consequences. The community buzz was electric. Social feeds were full of speculation, bets about whether I'd show up, and even watch parties. The Hendersons had invited friends. The Millers planned to attend in person, and Mrs. Patterson had her grandson set up her tablet so she wouldn't miss a second. Later that night, Linda found me in our bedroom, going over Brittany's glossy flyers one last time. "Are you ready?" she asked. Because once you step out from behind that screen and show your credentials, Brittany Turner's life ends as she knows it. I thought about the neighborhood chatter, the local news promos, the families waiting for entertainment. None of them realized they weren't about to watch simple community drama. They were about to witness the live collapse of a criminal empire. She'd made her choice the moment she decided to prey on neighbors she thought couldn't fight back. Closing my laptop, I told myself, tomorrow, Brittany gets the education about authority she's been promising everyone else. The only suspense was whether she'd realize her mistake before or after she destroyed herself live, in front of an audience. That night, I lay in bed listening to the murmur of neighbors chatting across their yards. Excitement hummed through the air like electricity before a storm. Brittany had promised them a spectacle, and she was going to deliver one, just not the version she'd advertised. As I drifted off, one thought lingered. Would Brittany recognize the trap before the walls closed in, or only when it was far too late? Friday night arrived. My finger hovered over the live stream notification, knowing it might mark either the most satisfying moment of my career or the most ironic case of poetic justice in HOA history. The community center was unrecognizable. By 6:45, I slipped into the back row, avoiding the initial rush, and surveyed the setup. It looked more like a broadcast studio than a neighborhood meeting. 3 camera rigs, blinding studio lights, and a branded backdrop, Turner Properties LLC, bold and gleaming, transformed the hall into her personal stage. Brittany had spared no expense. This wasn't a community session. It was a coronation. Folding chairs packed the room with over 80 residents, while the viewer counter on the stream climbed toward 400. The scale of attention would only magnify the impact of what was coming. Linda had claimed a seat midway down the row, her phone angled just right to capture clean audio without drawing attention. Tom Miller sat a few rows ahead, fighting to suppress laughter with the solemnity of someone at a church service. Even Mrs. Patterson had shown up, her grandson setting up her tablet so she could follow along on the stream while muttering pointed commentary about Brittany's theatrics. At exactly 7 o'clock, Brittany stepped up to the podium like a keynote speaker about to unveil a groundbreaking initiative. She dressed the part, navy suit sharp enough for a campaign ad, hair perfectly styled, makeup flawless under the lights. The image screamed ambition. Less HOA president, more aspiring mayor. "Good evening, neighbors," she began, her voice amplified and practiced. "Welcome to our community education session. Tonight, we address an issue affecting every homeowner: how to deal with entitled government employees who think their jobs make them untouchable." The live chat exploded instantly. Hundreds of viewers typed in stories about their own HOA battles, some cheering her on, others just rubbernecking at the unfolding drama. Perfect. I logged into TruthSeeker 2024, the account we designed for this exact moment. The chat was already alive with questions, comments, and horror stories from across the region. Brittany, monitoring in excellent question. "TruthSeeker," Brittany replied, flashing a confident smile as she clicked to a slide boldly titled Research and Assessment Strategies. This is why thorough background checks are everything before challenging any government employee. I always dig into income levels, job titles, and weak spots before applying pressure. What she didn't realize was that, in her arrogance, she was publicly confessing to systematic harassment, detailing her tactics while hundreds of people listened. I leaned in with my follow-up, my fingers tapping across the phone screen. But what if your research missed something important about their actual position? The room hushed, waiting. Brittany's eyes glowed as she leaned forward, gripping the podium as though she were about to deliver the most important revelation of her career. "That's impossible," she declared with unshakable certainty. "I've studied government employees for years. They're all the same: underpaid, overworked, terrified of conflict. None of them have real power." Her tone grew sharper, more triumphant. "Take Jim Rogers, for example." She gestured toward the back, oblivious that the spotlights blinded her to who was sitting there. "He's just a mid-level bureaucrat making maybe 50 grand a year. No resources, no influence, no ability to stand against real community authority." The live chat erupted instantly. Viewers were realizing they were witnessing a confession unfold in real time. Linda suppressed a grin while Tom Miller abandoned all restraint, grinning wide. Even Brittany's diehard supporters shifted uncomfortably as her words slid from confidence into reckless exposure. But Brittany wasn't done. For another 15 minutes, she laid out her so-called methodology. Flowcharts, statistics, success stories, it was all there. How she stalked vulnerable families, probed into finances, then launched coordinated pressure campaigns to drive people out of their homes. She wasn't just bragging. She was building the case against herself, and then came my next strike. What if you've misclassified the type of government employee entirely? I typed. Brittany's smile widened. "I don't make mistakes in classification," she said with chilling arrogance. "Jim Rogers? I know his type. Works downtown, office hours, routine admin role. He's the exact kind who folds under pressure, too broke for legal help, too disconnected to have political protection. That was the moment. The perfect setup. Slowly, I rose from my seat. The shuffle of chairs drew the attention of both the audience and the cameras. Conversations faded, the air heavy with anticipation. Brittany's presentation had peaked, and now the curtain was about to fall. "Actually, Brittany," I said, my voice calm but carrying across the silent room, "there's been a mistake about my qualifications." I reached into my jacket and withdrew a leather case. The live chat froze as I flipped it open, the gold seal gleaming beneath the lights. "I'm the Honorable James Rogers, United States Federal Judge for the Northern District." The silence was absolute. 80 neighbors, 400 online viewers, no one breathed. Brittany's face cycled from smug certainty to confusion, then to dawning horror as the truth hit her. She had just spent 25 minutes confessing to federal crimes. Directly to a federal judge. The room detonated into chaos. Neighbors gasped, shouted, some even laughed in disbelief. Phones lifted, recording what everyone knew would become neighborhood legend. Online, the chat window scrolled faster than the eye could follow, viewers stunned that they were watching a public implosion unfold live. Brittany broke first. "Turn off the cameras," she shrieked, all composure gone. But her stunned tech crew froze, and the live stream kept rolling, broadcasting her breakdown to an audience multiplying by the minute. "It's too late for that," I said evenly, years of judicial control steadying my voice. "You've confessed to fraud, harassment, conspiracy on camera, to hundreds of witnesses. Every word is evidence." The transformation was staggering. Brittany, who had marched in like a polished executive, had in less than half an hour turned herself into a defendant in front of the entire community. It was so perfect, so precise. It almost felt scripted. Except no scriptwriter would dare invent something this poetic. As neighbors shouted over each other. As the live stream chat roared, I locked eyes with the camera still broadcasting. Sometimes justice doesn't need a courtroom. Sometimes it plays out live. All time looked invigorated by the surge of engagement. For the first 10 minutes, she performed flawlessly, a polished lecture on government psychology, community authority, and tactics for asserting control. She displayed case studies with before and after photos of homes she'd brought into compliance. The crowd murmured approvingly, though I caught the discomfort on the faces of longtime residents who recognized those houses and knew the families behind them. That was my cue. I typed into the chat, "Truth Seeker 2024. Here, what happens if the government employee actually has more authority than your research shows?" Brittany's eyes sparkled as she read the question aloud. She smiled, convinced it was the perfect opening to showcase her brilliance. Never realizing she just stepped into the snare. Woman who had spent weeks preaching about authority was about to receive the ultimate crash course in consequences. As Brittany's live stream imploded and neighbors sat frozen in disbelief, I calmly slipped my judicial credentials back into my pocket. The silence was crushing until one phone buzzed, then another, then a chorus of notifications swept through the room. I turned to the camera, still broadcasting. "How long do you think it takes for something like this to go viral?" I asked. Have you ever seen that exact moment when someone realizes they picked the wrong person to mess with? Drop your stories in the comments because this is about to get wild, and wild it got. When someone unknowingly live streams their own professional destruction while confessing to federal crimes in real time, the internet doesn't just notice, it throws a celebration. By sunrise Saturday, Brittany's so-called educational seminar had exploded across social media. Hashtags like #governmentboy and #HOA Karen were trending in major cities. In less than 24 hours, her downfall had been viewed over 3 million times. My phone was chaos. 17 missed calls from reporters, 43 messages from colleagues, and even a voicemail from my court administrator, delicately asking if I required security measures due to the sudden media frenzy. Meanwhile, Linda sat at the kitchen table, her laptop glowing with notifications. Entertainment news outlets were begging for interviews, while social feeds looped Britney's humiliation on repeat. The internet had no mercy. Someone edited a highlight reel of Britney, smugly explaining government psychology cut with my credential reveal timed perfectly to dramatic music. Another clip showcased her infamous line, "I'm never wrong about classification," followed by the moment I revealed myself as a federal judge. The comedic timing was so brutal that late-night talk show writers were already scripting jokes. But the clip that truly detonated? An 8-minute supercut of Britney proudly detailing her harassment strategies, intercut with my calm questions as Truth Seeker 2024, culminating in her bold claim that government employees were weak. The irony was so devastating. It felt like satire. Linda's phone buzzed nonstop with view counts that looked like city population numbers. 200,000 shares, she muttered, scrolling. Comment sections overflowed with government employees, lawyers, and random viewers who couldn't believe what they'd just seen. Legal scholars were already calling it a textbook example of a self-inflicted confession. Social media users turned Britney into the internet's latest cautionary meme. And the calls didn't stop. Reporters wanted quotes on HOA corruption. Legal analysts wanted commentary on jurisdiction. Entertainment producers hinted at documentary deals. What had started as a neighborhood scandal was now a national conversation about power, accountability, and justice. Then came Sunday's call, the one that changed everything. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division, Judge Rogers, Agent Patricia Harris began, her tone both professional and impressed. "Your HOA president's livestream gave us exactly what we've been chasing for months. We'd been investigating complaints from other states, fraudulent HOAs, targeted harassment, forced property sales. In 25 minutes, she gave us the evidence we needed." The scale was staggering. Turner Properties LLC wasn't just tormenting our neighborhood, it was operating in 4 states, systematically preying on vulnerable homeowners. Families across the region now stepped forward with identical stories of forged documents, harassment campaigns, and property theft. Britney's lesson on authority had cracked open a multi-state federal case. That weekend, Linda and I pored over victim statements forwarded by the FBI. The same pattern repeated again and again. Find the vulnerable, fabricate authority, escalate pressure, and force sales at rock-bottom prices. My grandfather's cabin wasn't her only crime. She had been destroying families for years. The irony? Her bid for power had handed reform advocates the perfect weapon. HOA accountability groups cited her confession as proof of systemic abuse. Legal scholars referenced it in debates on federal oversight. Our small-town scandal had become a landmark case in national reform. But Britney wasn't done humiliating herself. Her lawyer booked a TV interview clearly meant to sway public sympathy. Instead, it detonated into her second viral disaster. "Miss Turner," the reporter asked with a sly smile, "why didn't you research Mr. Rogers' actual job title before targeting him?" Britney froze, then sputtered out, "Federal judges should identify themselves at community meetings. I can't be expected to research every single government employee's position." That clip spread faster than the first. In one sentence, Britney doubled down on victimhood while admitting she routinely targeted officials without doing proper research. The internet shredded her. The woman who once strutted as an authority figure was now the face of arrogance, ignorance, and poetic downfall. And the best part? Justice hadn't just been served, it had gone viral. The community's reaction was just as fascinating as the downfall itself. Neighbors who once cheered Brittany on during her rise now publicly admitted regret, some even posting online apologies for trusting someone who had so thoroughly deceived them. The Miller family quickly called for a neighborhood meeting to push reforms within the HOA, while Mrs. Patterson circulated a petition demanding tighter oversight of all financial dealings. By Monday, shocking news hit. Turner Properties LLC had filed for bankruptcy, crushed beneath federal investigations and civil lawsuits from countless victims. The ambitious development deal Brittany had schemed so hard for crumbled overnight when Megadev Corporation cut ties, citing ongoing criminal probes and irreparable reputational damage. Yet what truly struck me wasn't the legal collapse, but the flood of community support. Neighbors I had barely spoken to began knocking on our door, apologizing for not standing against Brittany sooner. The Hendersons brought over dinner, finally sharing their own HOA horror stories they'd once been too scared to voice. Even some of Brittany's closest allies admitted they'd kept silent out of fear, despite long harboring doubts about her tactics. On Tuesday night, Linda found me sitting quietly on the old wooden bench I'd built from salvaged cabin wood, scrolling through a stream of messages from fellow federal judges. "They're impressed," she said with a small smile, holding out her phone filled with notes of respect. What began as a neighborhood dispute had now become required viewing in judicial conferences across the nation. Brittany's so-called seminar had indeed turned into an educational tool, but not for her cause. Law schools were dissecting it as a case study in live-stream criminal confession. Federal prosecutors were sharing it as evidence of systematic fraud. Even management consultants were labeling it a textbook example of arrogance and collapse. Brittany Turner had set out to educate the world, and she did, but all anyone learned was the depth of her criminal corruption. By Wednesday, the story had made front-page news. A detailed article laid out the web of HOA fraud that stretched across state lines, supported by testimony from victims far beyond our neighborhood. The report concluded with an FBI agent's chilling words. "Ms. Turner's so-called educational broadcast gave us the strongest fraud evidence our office has seen all year. The irony wasn't lost on me. Brittany had wanted to prove her dominance over a federal judge, yet she had instead delivered a masterclass in her own downfall. The internet had devoured the spectacle, spreading it like wildfire. She achieved viral fame, yes, but in the form of evidence stamped into the federal record. 6 months later, I found myself in a surreal role reversal. For the first time in my 15-year judicial career, I wasn't on the bench, I was in the gallery, watching another judge preside over a trial where I was listed as the victim. Chief Judge Patricia Williams had been assigned to United States versus Brittany Turner, a case so sensational that it drew the kind of media frenzy our district hadn't seen in decades. The narrative was irresistible to national news. Neighborhood bully targets a federal judge, confesses crimes live on camera, ends up in federal court. When Brittany entered the courtroom, her orange jumpsuit was a sharp, humiliating contrast to the tailored suits she once flaunted. The woman who had arrogantly instructed others on how to handle government employees now shuffled in, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Her defense team had already burned through 3 law firms as federal charges piled higher. Wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, civil rights violations, and racketeering. Each count carved deeper into the empire she had built on lies. Judge Williams carried herself with a steady professionalism I respected, though I could sense even she's STR. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to listen HOA Stories, because the twists in this case prove just how far HOA corruption can really go. Prosecution's case was so overwhelming that Brittany's defense attorneys stopped even pretending she was innocent. Instead, they clung to pleas for leniency, citing her troubled upbringing and financial pressures as if they could excuse years of calculated fraud. But those arguments collapsed under the weight of the victim impact statements. One after another, 23 families from 4 different states took the stand. Their stories painted a devastating picture: lives shattered, homes stolen, and faith in community leadership destroyed. Elderly residents spoke through tears about being pressured to sell homes that had been in their families for generations. Young couples described how fraudulent HOA violations wrecked their credit and forced them into rental housing they could barely afford. The human suffering Brittany caused was staggering. Tom Miller revealed how Brittany had cornered him into acting as an unwilling informant. She threatened his own family with escalating violations unless he provided private details about neighbors' vulnerabilities. His testimony exposed the systematic way she maintained control through intimidation and fear. Then Mrs. Patterson, frail but resolute, told the jury about the deeper betrayal. "Our neighborhood," she explained, had once been a place where families grew up with values of respect, honesty, and legitimate authority. Brittany had poisoned that tradition, replacing trust with fear, and mistaking intimidation for leadership. But the most damning testimony came from Linda. She didn't just speak as my wife, she spoke as a corporate attorney who understood the exact laws Brittany had broken. Linda dissected Brittany's targeting methods, fraudulent documentation, and manipulation strategies with surgical precision. Her explanation was so sharp that jurors scribbled frantic notes. Realizing these weren't petty HOA squabbles, they were sophisticated crimes worth millions. Final nail in Brittany's coffin was the live stream that had started it all. The prosecution played the full 25-minute video, letting her own smug words spell out her intent, her methods, and her utter disregard for the law. Seeing her brag to a federal judge about her systematic strategy wasn't just incriminating, it was catastrophic. In desperation, Brittany's lawyers tried claiming entrapment, suggesting I had somehow coaxed her into confessing. Judge Williams dismissed the argument with thinly veiled disbelief. "Entrapment requires law enforcement to induce a crime," she explained. Brittany had already been committing these crimes for years. All I had done was let her talk. Finally, sentencing day arrived, the moment our community had been waiting for. Federal guidelines recommended 5 to 7 years, but Judge Williams went further. She cited the sheer number of victims, the sophistication of Brittany's scheme, and her breathtaking arrogance in believing HOA authority could override federal law. "Ms. Turner," Judge Williams declared, locking eyes with the woman who once terrorized families without fear, "you systematically preyed on vulnerable people, destroying their homes and their financial security. Your own words, broadcast for all to see, prove this was not an accident but a calculated empire built on suffering." The gavel fell. Brittany Turner was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation, complete restitution to all victims, and a lifetime ban from holding any position of financial trust. The restitution alone, over $1.8 million, bankrupted Turner Properties, LLC, and ensured she'd spend years after her release paying back the families she had devastated. Perhaps the most powerful moment came when Judge Williams addressed the larger lesson. Authority comes from law, not intimidation. Those who abuse trust will face consequences, no matter how powerless their victims may seem. Then she glanced briefly toward me and added, "The defendant spent months studying what type of government employee she was targeting. She simply chose the wrong one." As Brittany was led away in shackles, I finally felt the weight lift. Justice had spoken loud and clear. The healing began almost immediately. Tom Miller was elected our new HOA president, implementing strict transparency policies to prevent future abuse. Mrs. Patterson worked with local officials to strengthen oversight laws across our county. And Linda and I used the restitution funds to establish the Grandfather's Compass Foundation, dedicated to helping families fight predatory HOA enforcement nationwide. Our very first case was in Arizona, where an elderly veteran was being harassed by an HOA president who sounded eerily like Brittany. 2 years later, I sat on the porch of our rebuilt cabin, the sunset reflecting across the lake, my grandfather's restored compass warm in my hand. The new cabin stood taller, sturdier, built with the help of neighbors who had once been victims but were now allies. Together, we had transformed tragedy into resilience and exposed the truth about what happens when corruption mistakes itself for authority. UGG led to massacre reaction to the damning evidence. Video clips of Brittany smugly outlining her criminal playbook now played as exhibits, but this time there was no podium. No cheering supporters, just the cold weight of justice closing in. And as I sat there, watching the walls of her empire collapse in the one place she thought she'd never stand as a defendant, I realized Brittany Turner had indeed given the world a lesson about authority. Only, it wasn't her authority on display. It was the authority of truth, consequence, and the law. This is Listen HOA Stories, where real neighborhood battles reveal the shocking truths about power, corruption, and justice. If you're hooked, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more stories that expose what really happens behind HOA gates. What started as a nightmare had become something far greater, a symbol of resilience and proof that communities can rise stronger after being torn down. One evening, a neighbor passing with his dog paused at my gate and chuckled. "Hey Jim, remember when Brittany called you government boy?" I smiled and pointed to the memorial plaque Linda and I had placed by the front steps. She wasn't wrong. I am a government employee. She just never cared to check which branch of government signs my paychecks. The plaque read simply, "In memory of Grandfather Rogers." Below it, in smaller letters, "Grandfather's Compass Foundation helping communities. Navigate justice." As twilight deepened over our street, I reflected on how much had changed since that first day I returned home to find my cabin in ruins. Brittany Turner was serving her 3rd year in federal prison. Turner Properties was dissolved, its assets liquidated and returned to victims. And our neighborhood, once fractured by fear, was now a model of transparency. With HOA reform so strong that other communities were studying and replicating them, the viral storm had faded, but its educational impact remained. Law enforcement still used Brittany's live stream in training sessions on systematic fraud. Business schools dissected it as a lesson in catastrophic arrogance. And the internet never forgot the fascination of watching someone demolish their own empire while lecturing their victim had cemented her downfall as a permanent warning. Linda joined me on the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee, settling into her favorite chair. "Any regrets?" she asked, the question she often repeated during our quiet evenings. I looked across the lake, hearing laughter from yards now free of intimidation, seeing children play without fear of trumped-up violations, elders resting easy knowing their homes were safe. "None whatsoever," I said, raising my cup in a quiet toast to the rebuilt cabin, to the restored community, and to justice carried out with precision. Brittany Turner had taught us all something about the difference between authority and intimidation. Ironically, her educational seminar had become required viewing for HOA board certifications across multiple states. Even from prison, she was still teaching lessons about accountability, consequences, and the price of arrogance. That night, as Linda and I sat watching the stars ripple across the water where my grandfather once taught 3 generations of Rogers men to fish, I understood that some stories really do end the way they should. The bully defeated, the victims vindicated, the community healed, and justice delivered with a perfection even my grandfather's compass would have admired. Brittany's infamous live stream had racked up more than 15 million views, cementing her in internet history as the woman who taught the calm sin that taught the World, what happens when you underestimate your opponent while broadcasting your own crimes to an audience of millions. It was a legacy that would outlast her sentence, her fortune, and her reputation. A permanent reminder that true authority comes not from fear, but from law and justice. So that's how an HOA president tried to take down a federal judge only to livestream her own downfall in front of the entire world. Sometimes, the best revenge is simply letting the guilty expose themselves while you keep the receipts. What about you? Have you ever seen someone pick the absolute worst target for their scheme? Share your story below and don't forget to subscribe to Listen HOA Stories for more jaw-dropping tales of power, betrayal, and justice served. Until next time, keep listening, because the truth always echoes.